let's reach to Sophia, who's at the other end of the world, and we thank you very much for taking the time to join us in this new time zone that you've just discovered, Sophia. Religious populism manifests in unique ways, and while there are obvious differences across regions and cultures, there's a more subtle difference in how various groups within the same society actually experience religious populism. How does religious populism take shape in the different demographics of society? And Professor, is it possible to say that some groups are more vulnerable than others to being exploited by religious populism?
Religion is a key facet of populist groups. There's been increased exploitation of religion by political groups in order to defend one's imagined nation as sacred, as pure. And I have to say, for a religion to be successful in the first place, often the central figure or those promoting him used strategies familiar to today's populists, such as the us versus them paradigm and the message, follow us and we'll save you. So populist movements arise during times of rapid social change, as do new religious movements. And as this, it's not something new. Of course, we can distinguish between left-wing populism and right-wing populism, but most of what I'm going to say today has to do with contemporary right-wing populism. Many different religious groups have been co-opted by right-wing populist themes. And when we think about who's vulnerable to this type of ideology, it definitely finds a home in those religious groups that are exclusivists. They tend to believe that others are polluting. They prefer clear answers to ambiguity. They tend towards anti-intellectualism. They're anti-science. They don't like the perception that they're being controlled by elites. That they believe they have a sacred right to their resources, and they always find a scapegoat. They also tend to be nostalgic. They want to belong. They want easy answers. They feel disenfranchised. Sometimes they lack education. They feel that society has been disordered, usually by immigrants, people of color, women, or the LGBT community, and they want to restore it through violence. They believe that there's a cosmic battle to fight, and they believe that they're protecting what is sacred through this battle. Often they distrust mainstream media and they get their news from unsubstantiated sources on the internet. Sometimes they're bored. They're looking for a crisis. In fact, populism thrives on crisis and creates crises.
Sophia, public health is not often an immediate concern for religious populist groups, but through the use of social media and the internet, these groups have a platform to not only voice their opinion, but to gather support. And in the midst of the pandemic, we actually saw different religious populist groups and figures. And there were those who urged the public not to get vaccinated. They actually told their followers that vaccines were not permissible from a religious point of view, as we heard earlier, this distortion. Has the pandemic made religious populist groups stronger?
The answer is yes, because it further polarized us. It also led to religious and ethnic scapegoating. For example, Hindu nationalists blamed Indian Muslims for the pandemic. Many white Americans blamed Chinese people for the pandemic, etc. The pandemic raged during Trump's last year as president, and of course, as during Biden's first year thus far. So Trump's abysmal response to the pandemic probably cost him his second term. In the US, the pandemic has absolutely been politicized, as Republicans initially promoted the idea that warnings about the pandemic were propaganda aimed at taking down Trump. They tried to minimize its danger, calling it fake news or the plandemic, as if it was planned, the plandemic.
Yeah.
Somebody recently asked me, how's your plandemic going? I was kind of offended. So many believe that the government was overstepping in closing church services and later mandating vaccinations for employees. Gender is also at play here. Populists define what needs to be protected as the vulnerable culture, which is the culture is feminized here, like the populists are masculinized. And so the populists, want to be the macho defenders. And in terms of the pandemic, they're tough, brave, risk takers. They have super immune systems. They don't need booster shots. They don't need, COVID shots. They don't need masks. And they, in this paradigm, liberals are soft, oversensitive, weak. They're gendered feminine, right? And that's why liberals act like they need masks all the time. This is the paradigm that I'm describing.
Professor Pandya, civil activism plays an important role in the fight against religious populist regimes, and as a result, civil activists face a lot of threats, both at home and abroad. And they can include things like murder, kidnapping, imprisonment, etc. And we've seen recently in the case of Turkey, ordinary citizens with no history of activism facing prosecution. So much so that large numbers of civilians have been forced to take refuge in Greece and other countries following a dangerous journey over land and sea. Now, you've had the unique opportunity to interview many of these people who previously led ordinary lives. They were teachers, doctors, etc. Were there any themes that kept cropping up during this experience and their experiences? And what did you seek from that? And how is the AKP's Islamic populism designed to divide, for example, dehumanize, and ultimately criminalize the opponents of AKP?
After the July 15th, 2016 coup attempt in Turkey, Turkish President Erdogan and his AKP placed the blame squarely on a group called the Hizmet movement without awaiting for evidence. So this group is also known as the Gülen movement. It's a civil society movement dedicated to interfaith dialogue, pluralism, and STEM-focused education. As of October 1st, 2021, the AKP-led government has arrested almost 100,000 people, detained almost 500,000 people, and closed and taken over 190 media outlets, shut down over 3,000 educational institutions. So despite Erdogan's previous graft scandal, which took place in 2013, after his 2014 bid to be Turkey's president instead of prime minister, he emerged more powerful. Why? Because he opened up the populist playbook. So he used polarizing rhetoric. He relentlessly demonized his opponents. Even before Erdogan won the April 16, 2017 constitutional referendum vote, which granted him near dictatorial powers and consolidated his authority to rule by decree, he had already resorted to increasingly harsh methods to repress his opposition, especially targeting Hizmet movement, also Kurds, Alevis, and anybody he found to be threatening to him. So he furthered their ostracism, social ostracism, whereby even casual participants were fired, rejected, reported by neighbors, friends, family members, sometimes jailed, and even tortured. And there's a lot of human rights organizations that have documented this torture. So this march towards authoritarianism and the purge as a component of that have to be understood as reflective of the global rise of populist and nationalist politicians like Donald Trump, Narendra Modi, Rodrigo Duterte, Bolsonaro, Le Pen, etc. Towards understanding this phenomenon, it's worth noting parallels with other groups like Pol Pot's populist Khmer Rouge, which was also characterized by a quasi-religious form of patriotism. Utopian ambition, self-consuming paranoia. Manifestly xenophobic, obviously both the Khmer Rouge and even the Nazis, not just even the Nazis, especially the Nazis, resorted to scapegoating on a genocidal scale. In Turkey, Erdogan's scapegoats are members of the Hizmet movement, but also those that I've mentioned before, Kurds, Alevis, even Yazidis, others, journalists, certainly journalists, and so forth. So Erdogan's populism, he positioned himself as a hyper-masculine Devlet Baba, which means father of the nation, who alone can make Turkey great again and save it from its ubiquitous enemies. It's a key facet of his rule now. And this reflects this semi-divine image of the state in Turkish political culture, exemplified by this notion of sultans as being Zulullah fil ard, or God's shadow on earth. So Erdogan emerges more powerful due to this rhetoric, due to this, because he opened this populist, playbook. And so I did interview survivors of Erdogan's purge. I did interview many torture victims, and it's hard to interview torture victims. I'm sure it's much harder to be them. They spoke, the people I interviewed spoke of spiritual resilience, increased empathy for others, and a new recognition of the suffering of Armenians and Kurds, and a commitment to the price of freedom. They, those participants that managed to leave Turkey for abroad find themselves in permanent exile, unable to return to their families, lives, professions, and very identities. My interviewees described loss of family, friends, occupations, property, even citizenship. But they also found ways to reframe their trauma and sometimes to create beauty, meaning, and spirituality out of their ordeals. Their stories that they shared with me so eloquently included terror, agony, heartache, grief, but also hope and spirit.